Welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. This program was produced by Victoria Basulto in conjunction with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum and funded by the Catherine W. Davis Projects for Peace Fellowship, awarded through Colgate University. Black History in Upstate New York will provide a combination of bite-sized informational videos and longer presentations by scholars on historical figures and places that emphasize the crucial role Black Americans have played in the history of Upstate New York. The National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum honors anti-slavery abolitionists, their work to end slavery, and the legacy of that struggle, and strives to complete the second and ongoing abolition, the moral conviction to end racism. The Museum and Hall of Fame's contact information is available on the screen. Hello, and once again, welcome to Black History in Upstate New York. My name is Victoria Basulto, and it is my honor to introduce our presenter for today, Kate Clifford Larson. Dr. Larson is a best-selling author and an award-winning historian who has written biographies on historical figures including Rosemary Kennedy, Fannie Lou Hamer, Mary Surratt, and Harriet Tubman. She received her Ph.D. in American history with an emphasis on modern U.S. women's and African American history from the University of New Hampshire. Her expertise on Harriet Tubman has allowed her to serve as a consultant historian for projects such as the Harriet Tubman Home and National Parks, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, and the feature film Harriet. Dr. Larson has also consulted for many documentaries featuring the stories of Kennedy, Surratt, Tubman, and African American history. She lives in Massachusetts with her family and their elderly but still chirpy cockatiel, Cecilia. I'd like to now invite Dr. Larson to begin her presentation.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about Harriet Tubman and her time in Auburn, New York. She lived there for 50 years of her life, and she had many friends, and it was a safe place, a place where she brought her family, and so I'm really excited to talk about it. So I'm going to start off just giving a brief overview of Tubman and where she came from and how she ended up in the city and her life there. So she was born on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in March 1822, and she spent her life as an enslaved girl and young woman in Dorchester and Caroline counties on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Her parents, her friends, her family helped raise her and protect her, teach her survival skills that became really important later in her life, especially along the Underground Railroad. But it was a tight-knit community that was constantly under threat, but everyone worked together to protect each other as best that they could, and she learned a lot from that community. These are the landscapes that she grew up on the Eastern Shore: rivers and streams, marshes, the bay, the Chesapeake Bay, forests and fields, agricultural fields. And there was a rich spiritual life that she experienced there on the Eastern Shore, rooted in African cultural and religious spiritual traditions, as well as evangelical Christianity. And her faith and her belief in God helped sustain her through her most trying times, but throughout her entire life. And this is a picture of a historic church on the Eastern Shore. When she was 27 years old, her enslaver, Edward Brodess, died, and his estate was deeply in debt. And she knew that she and her siblings were going to be sold. She had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. 3 of the sisters, by the time that Tubman was 27 years old, 3 of those sisters had been sold away. And so she knew the threat to a family was dire and real. So she decided in the fall of 1849 to escape. She approached a Quaker woman who lived in Caroline County in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, And the woman told her to sweep the front yard so it would look like she belonged there. And when her husband got back from work in the fields, he would take her to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. And she found her way to Pennsylvania. And she said, when she reached the Pennsylvania line, quote, "When I had found that I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But freedom felt hollow to her because everyone she loved, she had to leave behind when she escaped being sold. She could not feel entirely free, so she determined then when she reached Philadelphia that she would return and rescue her family members." I'd like to segue a little bit to talk about how she did that, and which plays into how she ended up in Auburn, New York. But I'd like to mention how she did not conduct her rescue missions. She did not use the quill code. That's fake. It was made up. It's a 20th century fake lore that was created. The lawn jockey was not part of the Underground Railroad. Those statues were not even invented until after the Civil War. The famous song, "Follow the Drinking Gourd," what the people sing today, was actually written and first performed in 1947. It had nothing to do with the Underground Railroad. The North Star, however, Tubman was very clear that the North Star was really important to her, and that's what she used to navigate her way to freedom in the North. She grew up in a maritime community, maritime workers, and her father taught her how to read the night sky, to read the landscapes, the woods, the rivers and streams. So she had that great literacy to be able to read the environment, including that night sky and the all-important North Star. When she arrived in Philadelphia, she settled into a safe kind of anonymity in the largest free Black community in the country at the time. There she met Quaker suffragist and abolitionist Lucretia Coffin Mott, later telling a friend that Mott was the first white woman to help her in that city. She also met William Still, one of the most famous Underground Railroad agents of all time, there on the right-hand side of the screen with Lucretia Mott. Thomas Garrett in Wilmington, Delaware, and Reverend Samuel Green was a free Black man in Dorchester County who was an Underground Railroad agent, and he helped her too. In the South, there were many people who helped others escape, predominantly African Americans, and Reverend Green represents those people who helped freedom seekers escape to the North. From Philadelphia, she generally took a train to New York City, then to Albany, where a man by the name of Stephen Myers and his wife Harriet helped freedom seekers like Tubman along to Syracuse, where Reverend Jermaine Logan had an Underground Railroad stop, and then on to Rochester and Buffalo and Niagara Falls and St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada. Auburn became a focus a little later on in the 1850s as Tubman became more active on the Underground Railroad. The network that she was connected to spanned hundreds of miles throughout the Upper South, Pennsylvania, New York, even New England and into Canada. That network of individuals, and there were scores of people that Tubman relied upon and received support and help from. And over the 10-year period, 1850 to 1860, she rescued about 70 people, family and friends, people that she knew, in about 13 trips back and forth into Maryland. She also supplied information to another 70 individuals or so who found their way independently using her instructions. But how did she end up in Auburn, New York, and become friends with William Henry Seward and his wife, Frances? Lucretia Mott's sister was Martha Coffin Wright, and she lived in Auburn with her husband, David, who was William Henry Seward's law partner. And Seward, during the 1850s, had become a United States senator. And like the Motts and the Wrights and other people, the Sewards were actively involved in the progressive movements of the day: abolition, women's rights, religious liberty, education reform, support for immigration, prison reform. And they also hid freedom seekers in their homes. Tubman found them to be kindred spirits. She was very close to Garrett and Ann Smith in Peterborough. Malvina Russell, Viney Russell, who was worked in the household of the Smiths, was very close to Tubman. Anna Marie Douglas, Frederick Douglass's wife, they lived in Rochester, but she had been freeborn in Maryland, and they had a kinship, Tubman and Anna Marie Douglas. And Eliza Wright Osborne, the daughter of Martha Coffin Wright, who lived there in Auburn, was very close to Tubman too. They provided a circle of women that Tubman found comfort with, and just support and friendship. And these are the men that were part of that network. And this is just a small sampling of the men in central New York and in Auburn that were part of Tubman's life. Stephen Myers here, that was in Auburn, Garrett Smith in Peterborough, Frederick Douglass, of course, William Seward, Jermaine Logan in Syracuse, and John W. Jones actually in Elmira, New York. And interestingly, Jermaine Logan had a daughter who witnessed Harriet Tubman coming through their home in Syracuse with freedom seekers who had buckshot in their legs, and she watched Tubman take the buckshot out of their skin, and the little Logan daughter decided that she wanted to be a doctor because of what she saw watching Harriet Tubman. So Tubman's legacy lived on in these families that supported her. She affected them as well. So this is a view of Auburn, New York, last quarter of the 19th century. And Tubman started bringing freedom seekers there for safety and protection. And in fact, Martha Coffin Wright writes in her letters to her family that Tubman brought some freedom seekers, the Ennals family, through their home. And she described in vivid detail in her letters what happened to this family, that they had to hide and feed the baby paregoric because they didn't want the baby to cry out, and expose them and put them at risk for being caught by slave catchers. And how Tubman, quote, would go out foraging and, quote, sometimes could not get back till dark, fearing she would be followed. Then if the Ennals family had crept it further in, she couldn't find them, she would whistle or sing certain hymns and they would answer her. So Tubman used the music as a code to protect them, that it was safe to come out or it was not safe to come out yet. So these letters are vivid and very moving, that the families in Auburn would write about Tubman and her refugees that she brought north. The Auburn Seminary was also a place where freedom seekers could find shelter. Nat and Lizzie Amby, who escaped in 1857 from Dorchester County, they were friends of Tubman's. She gave them instructions to escape, and they landed in Auburn. It had been founded in 1819, and it was kind of notorious for sheltering freedom seekers, particularly during the summertime. The seminary is no longer there, but I think one of the buildings still exists. But Auburn was this hotbed of abolitionist activity, and Tubman knew she could find a safe place there. And in fact, even though she had settled in St. Catharines in Ontario, Canada during the 1850s with her family, she wanted to move to Auburn because she knew her family would be safe there. By the late 1850s, she was lecturing widely, trying to raise money to support her family that she had rescued and brought north. And she needed a place for them to live, and she wanted to be in the United States. So, but she struggled to support them. And she knew that Tubman she knew that Auburn was a good place for that. It had a small Black community, as well as these very supportive white abolitionist progressives that lived there. So in May of 1859, Stewart sold Harriet Tubman a 7-acre farm, complete with a newly built wood frame house on South Street on the Auburn and Fleming line. The farm was once part of a considerable land holding trust owned by Francis Seward's father, Elijah Miller. The Sewards sold Tubman the home for $1,200 with a $100 down payment that Tubman had earned giving lectures throughout New England. And you can see this is the location of her home on this old map. And as I said, the free African-American settlement in Auburn was well established and very important to Tubman and other freedom seekers that arrived there. The settlement was called New Guinea. There were families like the Freeman family that were very important part of this Underground Railroad network, and Harriet Tubman knew them and knew them very well. Harriet Bogart, pictured here, worked for the Stewarts, as did her husband Nicholas. And they owned their own home on Miller Street nearby. And some of the freedom seekers that followed Tubman to Auburn sought shelter and help from the Stewarts. And this is a runaway ad for Thomas Elliott, who fled in March of 1857 with 7 other people. They became famously known as the Dover Eight. And Thomas Elliott ended up moving to Auburn when he reached freedom in Canada. And he lived in a building owned by the Stewarts, actually right across the street from the Stewart home, which is pictured here. So the Stewarts and Tubman and her family and friends were intimately connected through mutual friendship and support. When the Civil War started, Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts knew that Tubman would be very helpful to the United States Army. So he made arrangements for her to go to South Carolina, and there she became a spy and a scout, but also a nurse and a cook for the Union Army. She participated in a very important raid up the Combahee River in June of 1863. She was credited with leading the raid, the first American woman to leave an armed conflict. And recently she was awarded membership in the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame of the United States Army because of her work as a spy and a scout. She was just a brilliant strategist, and Union officers were in awe of her skill and ability. She also witnessed the famous Battle of Fort Wagner, where the Massachusetts 54th All-Black Regiment fought so bravely and valiantly. And she later went on to talk about the battle, the death of the soldiers, and then she nursed them in the hospitals in Beaufort, South Carolina, after the battle. So she was an important part of her continuing war against slavery, went from on the landscapes of the Eastern Shore of Maryland to the battlefields in the South during the Civil War. On her way home after the war ended, she was brutally beaten and cast off a train, and the new reality of race relations in the country was beginning to emerge. That early Jim Crow prejudice just landed squarely on her. As this Civil War veteran, she was denied access to riding on a car on the train in order to ride in the baggage car. She was beaten by the conductor of the train. She broke ribs in her shoulder. So when she arrived home in the late fall of 1865, she was weakened and disabled, and her family had collected in her home there in Auburn, and they struggled through that winter. It was a very difficult winter. They lacked food. She said that they had to burn their fences to keep the house warm. So it was a difficult time. But the Auburn community stepped up, and they would provide baskets of food for her and her family to help get her through the winter so that she could plant in the spring and have food for her family. A local Geneva, New York woman, Geneva is about 20 miles from Auburn. Sarah Bradford was a Victorian author, and she wrote Harriet Tubman's first biography in 1868, the proceeds of the sale of which were used to help support Tubman and her family. She had this house full of dependents, her parents, elderly parents, in-laws, nieces and nephews, and so she needed the help, and they were there to step in and help her. And in fact, there are some diaries that have come to light recently of families in Auburn talking about Tubman, and there's one from the Ives family that lived on South Street, about 2 blocks from Harriet Tubman's home on South Street. And one of the little Ives children wrote a reminiscence later in her life, and she said, quote, "The maid would announce, 'Mrs. Tubman is here,' and mother would ask if Tubman had breakfast, and if she had not, a full meal was prepared for her. She would then go to the living room and visit with Dr. Ives. And the young girl goes on to describe how Tubman was always in need of money, and Dr. Ives, this young girl's father, kept a $5 bill and a $10 bill in his desk. And whenever Tubman gave by, he would offer her the money, and she always promised to pay it back, even though he told her she never needed to pay it back. And the children were instructed that if she ever returned with the money, to put the money back in the drawer. And if she returned again needing money when he wasn't there, they were to go to the desk and pull out the $5 and the $10 and give it to her. So the children were involved in this network of support as well. Tubman married a young veteran, 22 years younger than she was, Nelson Davis, shown here in the left side of the group photo. His name was Nelson Davis, and he arrived in Auburn in 1866 and boarded at her house. He worked in the mills, and they fell in love, and she married him. And they raised a daughter. They adopted a girl named Gertie. Harriet Tubman is there on the left holding the pan. She's just finished feeding her chickens. And next to her is their adopted daughter, Gertie. And then Nelson, and then a neighborhood girl, Lee Cheney, an elderly couple, John Andrew and Sarah Parker, who stayed with Tubman, an orphan, Walter Green, standing between them, and then a niece, Doris Stewart. So her house was always filled with people that she cared for, and she and Nelson raised their daughter together there. Tubman worked as a domestic. She had a farm. She raised vegetables. She sold them. She traded them. She sold her eggs and traded them, made butter from her dairy cows. So she was actively involved in the community in buying and selling and trading things that she needed for her family. She also took in the disabled, the sick, the orphaned, throughout her entire life. Her family was close by. Many of them moved from Canada to be with her in Auburn. In the upper right-hand corner is William Henry Stewart, her brother, and a niece, Margaret Stewart Lucas, below. They worked in the brickyards. They worked in the mills. They ran their own businesses, and they were very successful in the city. In 1880, her wood frame house burned, and she and her husband and the community rebuilt the house with bricks made on her property. And this is the house that you will be able to visit soon when it is reopened. The local orphanage sent children to live with Tubman, and this is just one of the records from the orphanage that was recently discovered, and it talks about Tubman taking in a blind and disabled girl who ended up dying under Tubman's care. She had tuberculosis. Tubman petitioned for a pension from the United States government. She was denied, but she did receive a pension from her husband, who died, Nelson Davis, in 1888. She received a widow's pension, and then later she was given her own pension as a Civil War nurse. She was very active in the women's rights movement. Here she is in a group photo with the National Colored Women's Convention in Washington, D.C. in 1896. She was close to Susan B. Anthony and Ida B. Wells Barnett and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. She wanted the right to vote. She said at one point that she had suffered enough for it and she wanted to vote. She purchased the 25 acres next to her residence so that she could open a home for the aged, here seen in two different photographs on the left. And she helped build the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church, which is now part of the National Park in Auburn. And this was the pride of her life, to be able to take care of people and to have a spiritual home for herself and her community. Queen Victoria admired her so greatly. After reading her biography in 1897, she sent Tubman this magnificent, beautiful lace shawl and a Silver Jubilee medal that Tubman greatly cherished. She was very, very famous in the early 1900s. Newspaper reporters visited her repeatedly and published her story in the newspapers. She was quite famous. And they wrote about how she tried to raise a bear cub that had been orphaned. She had a famous goose that laid large eggs. She rode a bicycle around town, and children in the city of Auburn used to love to visit her, do chores on her property, and then she would tell them stories about the Underground Railroad and the Civil War. She also opened an infirmary, sort of a nursing home, in addition to a home for the aged called John Brown Hall, which is where she herself ended up dying in March 10th, 1913, and she was 91 years old. And that year, after her funeral, which was attended by hundreds of people that traveled from all over the country, the funeral was at the AME Zion Church in Auburn, and she's buried at Fort Hill Cemetery across the street from the church. And that year, the New York Times included Tubman as one of the most important people to have died in the world that year. So that's how famous she was. In 1915, the Empire State Federation Club raised money to put a headstone on her grave, and it got destroyed in a hurricane in 1938, and there is a new stone that was put there shortly thereafter, which is the stone that is there today, and people visit it and leave little tokens and messages and notes for her. And this photograph on the bottom of the recent photograph of the grave shows one of Tubman's great nieces, Judy Bryant. We now have a national park in Maryland, a state park in Maryland, a byway in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and that people can visit. And now her property in Auburn, New York, the 30 acres is a national park, as well as the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church. Tubman's legacy lives on in this movement across the country to build more statues and more memorials to her. She really affects people, particularly children. Children seem incredibly attracted to her story. They identify with her passion and her skills. And for some children who struggle with reading, they could see that Harriet Tubman accomplished so much, even though she could not read or write, but she had tremendous literacies, and they identify with that. So children especially are deeply moved and affected by her. And this mural in Cambridge, Maryland depicts what Tubman really represents. She reached out and she supported people. She loved to be part of a community and making the world a better place. John Lewis told us that Harriet Tubman, quote, "Harriet Tubman means everything to me. She was a warrior, a fighter, a leader, a source of inspiration to hundreds and thousands and millions of people, even today." And that is true. Harriet Tubman was a civil rights activist, humanitarian. She stood for freedom, equality, justice, and self-determination. These are the values that guided Tubman throughout her life. These are the values she found in Auburn too, a deep and mutually caring community born in struggles and a belief that the world could be a better place. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Dr. Larson for this wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Larson's work, you can visit her personal website at www.katecliffordlarson.com. If you'd like to learn more about Harriet Tubman, I recommend that you read Dr. Larson's book, Bound for the Promised Land. Please also visit the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum's website, where there is information for Harriet Tubman, as she is one of the abolitionists inducted into the Hall of Fame. You are also more than welcome to visit the Harriet Tubman Home located in Auburn, New York. I'd also ask that you click on the survey link available on the screen and also in the video description to fill out a survey that will allow you to provide any feedback for this presentation or for the program in general. This information will help us in the formulation of future presentations and future programs. Once again, thank you, and I hope you join us in tomorrow's presentation.